Hey friends, how's it going? And yes, today is another in a series of Reddit stories. I'd really appreciate it if you'd like to like and subscribe. So here we go.
One time I had to spend the night with my elderly grandmother. Family friends asked me to look after her while they were away. I was sleeping at night when suddenly I heard my grandmother calling me by name. I went to her room to find out what happened. When I asked her, she replied that she hadn't called me. Then she suddenly added, "It was Ruby who called you." We were alone in the house, and I thought she was just getting confused because of her age. I started to leave the room when I suddenly heard my name again, but the voice sounded completely different. Turning around, I saw my grandmother looking at me intently and saying, "I told you it's Ruby, she's waiting for you." In hell. I was 16 at the time and I froze in shock. Without thinking, I called my parents and asked them to come get me as soon as possible. 30 years have passed, but I still get goosebumps when I remember that night.
Story number 2.
The man lived alone and worked in an office. One evening, he received a package. This seemed strange since he hadn't ordered anything. Inside the box was a regular alarm clock. On the back, there was an inscription that read 2:15. The man decided it was just someone's silly prank and placed the alarm clock on a shelf. But that night, he suddenly woke up to a strange noise. Looking at his watch, he noticed that it was time. 2:14. Suddenly, he remembered the alarm clock and decided to check it. As he got closer, he heard a sharp ringing. The alarm clock started ringing, even though the man was sure he hadn't set it. As he tried to turn off the device, he noticed that the ringing suddenly stopped on its own. Turning around, he noticed that the apartment door was slightly ajar, even though he had locked it carefully before going to bed. Feeling anxious, the man decided to check the surveillance footage at the entrance. In the video, he saw an unknown person breaking into his apartment. The uninvited guest was wearing a mask and had an axe. And exactly at 2:15, this man ran out of the apartment as if he were escaping from something.
Story number 3.
I've always loved solo hikes. It was a way to disconnect from the hustle and bustle and spend time alone in nature. I often ventured far away from civilization, where there were no people and no signal. But this hike became my last. That day, I hiked more than usual. The fatigue hit me harder than I expected. So by 8 in the evening, I packed up the camp, put out the fire, and crawled into the tent. I sleep lightly, especially in the woods, so I always set up my tent with the entrance close at hand. Knife, as always, was lying nearby in case of uninvited guests, animals, or people. I woke up suddenly. The silence was broken by a quiet, barely audible sound. The tent zipper was slowly unzipping. Instantly, alarm kicked in. I grabbed the knife and shouted that I was armed. There was no response. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and then suddenly I heard a sharp thud. Someone was running away from the tent. I sat there with the knife in my hand, tense to the limit. A little time had passed, but it felt like an eternity. When everything fell silent, I decided not to tempt fate. I packed my things in a hurry and left without waiting for dawn. The adrenaline kept me on my feet all night. The next morning, I learned from the news that a man's body had been found nearby in the woods. He was brutally murdered, and it didn't seem like a coincidence. I understood right away. The killer came to me that night. I went to the police to tell my story. Of course, I became a suspect. They interrogated me for hours, searched my belongings, but in the end, they let me go. There was no evidence against me. Since then, I no longer go on solo hikes. The maniac, as I later found out, was never caught. And sometimes I think that if I had slept a little deeper that night, I might not be sitting here writing this story.